defense attorney doesn't really have to care about the truth. They just have to minimize the punishment to their client, try to get their client found not guilty.
Okay, wait. So I think this is a really good discussion. So I'm going to ask you one more time, or I'm going to ask you, what do you think is the job of a defense?
This is literally the CSI effect, bringing in forensic analysis in order to confuse jury.
I understand that, and you're on the law enforcement side, so it should feel like a lot of bullshit. The defense is literally there to make your job as hard as possible. Problem is that if we start laxing those standards, then you run into other very weird shit. So like...
Do you just want me to get into it?
Yeah, knock yourself out.
Okay, cool. So a few months back, I think I was having Dooby, who was actually the gentleman who was asking you about whether or not we should be able to put people down. That was actually the guy that I was having a passionate discussion with about police brutality and police reform. And I think you jumped into that conversation because it was getting a little bit heated. And then after that fact, basically it was posted as a video, and I think some people in your community might have gotten a false impression of what my arguments were. So I kind of wanted to run you through my perspectives, and then I know that you like contention. So if there isn't any contention, we could probably just blaze right through these arguments. And if there is contention, then we can stop and hash them out. So that was pretty much my plan.
Okay, yeah, if you want to, sure.
Okay, cool. So one of the main contentions...
Just real quick, just so I can just get it. You and Dooby are like mortal enemies or some shit, right?
I mean, a little bit. He says he loves me, so I think I have to love him back just through like, cultural Christian reciprocity. But I did tell himself to like fuck himself with a broom repeatedly. So I don't know.
Gotcha.
You know? So if he's into that, maybe we're on good terms. I don't know. So we'll see. We can ask him later. But so for those of you who don't know, my name is Connor. I run a YouTube channel named Counterpoints, and that's pretty much it. I identify as centrist or center-right. You can catch me on most of the Twitch panels. But just so we can get into it, so one of the things that I think we might have had a little bit of contention about was the concept of like judicial innocence versus actual innocence. And my contention would be that these are two separate concepts. So just because somebody through the court system isn't viewed as basically like the court's never going to say somebody is innocent, right? They're going to say somebody's not guilty. But that has like very little to do with the actual concept of the or that has very little to do with their actual innocence or guilt. Have I lost you so far?
I mean, like, I'm hearing you, but I would very cautiously agree to this with somebody that I know very well, but I would outhandedly just reject that they should even be a recognized concept in 99% of my discussions. So, but go ahead.
Okay, so I mean that's interesting. I wouldn't mind just pausing there because maybe there's some contention right there. So what do you mean by you wouldn't recognize that in 99% of your discussions?
I just don't know how much value there is in recognizing whether or not somebody is actually innocent or not. Like that just sounds like a big red herring for like fuck the courts. We need to figure out like what really happened or whatever, which is just not a good way to approach things, I think.
Sure. And like we could probably jump ahead to the point where we agree on that, but just to highlight my issue with that like conception or like how I would apply it. I think we could talk about like O.J. Simpson, or we could talk about Casey Anthony, people who there's not really like a real rational explanation for what happened besides the thing that everybody suspects them of doing. But due to a lack of physical evidence, these people were found not guilty by the courts.
Sure.
So that's where we can highlight that at least conceptually, right?
Okay, sure.
Okay. All right. So there might not be like any social utility for it, but just describing reality, that would kind of be my contention. And then just to get into maybe the point of agreement. I think the system itself, this is something that Pisco and I actually got into a while ago. I think you're right to be cautious that individuals can have like revenge motivated reasoning or vengeance motivated reasoning, or they can be extremely emotional about stuff.
So let me be clear. I don't actually care about any of that. That's not actually what I'm concerned about. What I want
Yeah,
people
what's
to
your concern?
understand is I want people to understand how institutions are supposed to function and what the jobs of those institutions are for. And then we can talk about the underlying merits, why that is afterwards, but that's what I want people to understand. So for instance, the institution of our criminal justice system or in a court is not to discern reality or make absolute statements of like epistemic truth or not. The goal is to see if they can find you guilty of a crime. If they can't, then they can't. The burden of proof is on the state to prove a crime, and that's it. That's the extent to what it can do. And that's how it ought to function. And that's it. Because when people start getting weird things, weird ideas about like the courts are the ultimate arbitrators of truth, and like it leads you down bad roads of thinking that courts have more power than they do and that courts have jobs that they shouldn't have. So that's why I shy away from that. Not necessarily about like revenge stuff or anything like that.
Do you think it's possible, like so for instance, I was toying with this idea but I couldn't get it like focused from like a utilitarian standpoint or whatever. I couldn't figure out how the system would actually function. Do you think it would ever be possible to actually just have like prosecutors kind of with a similar burden of proof in the system as it stands right now, but then defense attorneys are just like, I don't know, moderators or administrators who are there to make sure the system isn't played poorly? Because right now, like an aggressive defense basically means that a defense attorney doesn't really have to care about the truth. They just have to minimize the punishment to their client and hopefully try to get their client found not guilty.
Okay, wait. So I think this is a really good discussion. So I'm going to ask you one more time, or I'm going to ask you, what do you think is the job of a defense? What do you think the defense exists for?
In the current system or hypothetical?
In the current system, what does it exist for? What should it exist for? Like, what do we think it should exist for?
Yeah. Okay. So that's two different questions, but I'll answer both.
Okay.
So for the first one, how it exists right now, I think the way that it exists right now is basically to give the defendant an aggressive defense. So basically to either minimize the punishment that they're going to receive, or to basically get their client not guilty. I know that lawyers aren't technically supposed to be able to lie, but I think in practice that's probably bullshit.
Okay. So what maybe this is talking around and maybe I'm being indirect or maybe this isn't fair, but I would argue that the goal of a defense, what the defense ought to do is the defense's job is to try to say, here is something that could have happened, like, could you really say that this didn't happen? Like, that's the goal of the defense, is to give a narrative or a story or a retelling of events that the jury might find plausible. And if that is the case, so the defense is able to do that, then the jury can't convict. That's the goal of the defense, basically. The defense exists to basically say the state needs to prove to a jury that my story could never have happened. Beyond a reasonable doubt, the state must lay out a convincing narrative. And my goal is to just provide you like, well, maybe this happened. This is an alternative thing that could have happened. That's essentially the goal of the defense.
Yeah, and I think that's what's frustrating. So for those of you who don't know, like I'm a law enforcement veteran and a military veteran. So I think that's like a lot of the frustration from the law enforcement side is I agree with you that that's what the defense does. But at the same time, like, oh God, like just from like a procedural standpoint, as far as like obtaining evidence sufficient to secure a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt, that shit's hard as fuck. Yep. Just to talk about it descriptively, like witnesses will sometimes get intimidated out of, basically, God, I don't even want to say advocating in their own self-interest because oftentimes they're acting self-interested. But witnesses can be intimidated out of testifying. Victims oftentimes have prior relationships with their assailants. So sometimes they don't even want to punish the people who have done harm to them. Sometimes it's actually taken upon the state. I'm actually thinking of a domestic violence case in particular where the victim doesn't even want to prosecute because they love the perpetrator, and the state was like, no, this is so egregious, we're gonna continue. And so there's like a whole host of reasons why a case can fall flat on its ass that have nothing to do with the events that actually transpired.
Sure. So just to be clear there, it's my understanding is that it's never up to an individual for whether or not the state will prosecute. It can only be up to an individual if they want to personally like press like civil charges against somebody. So for instance, if I beat the shit out of somebody and somebody catches me, like whether or not the state presses charges has nothing to do with the victim. Now maybe it might play that out that way because they want them as a witness and the victim, refuses, et cetera, et cetera. But the state will press charges if there's like an illegal offense, like a criminal offense. Now, if that individual wants to take them to civil court and press charges for damages or whatever, that's like a separate thing, I think, right?
I would be curious about that myself, only because like sworn written affidavits, the things that like people wrote down narratives of what occurred, it literally has a box that says like I will prosecute or I will not prosecute. So I know that the state is basically prosecuting on their behalf because they have to appoint a state attorney in order to get through that process. And I'm sure it's ultimately the state that is saying like, an offense has been committed, we're prosecuting on behalf of this victim, right? So it's really the state that's doing the heavy lifting. But also just like conceptually, from like I don't know, like a pragmatic standpoint. From a pragmatic standpoint, if somebody signs I will not prosecute and it's not like a grievous felony, the state won't do shit with that.
Yeah, I'm totally guessing because I just don't know. But my guess is going to be that those are cases where you literally have like a single witness. That's going to be my guess. So like in the event of like a domestic abuse case that's not caught by anybody else, if the abusee is not going to testify, like, well, what the fuck are you going to do? Like, how are you going to do that investigation? Right? That'd be my guess in that case. So it's not do you want to prosecute? Because it's the state that's prosecuting it. It's like, will you testify? And if you're not going to testify, the state really has no case because there's no way that's my guess. Now, I'm not a legal person. That would be my guess, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure Pisco could elucidate both of us on it. But my my experience with this on a firsthand basis is that there are like so for instance, like on the night of let's just say passions have flared. I think that's a tactful way to put it. So oftentimes people on the night of are perfectly willing to prosecute because they're like, nah, fuck that motherfucker. They beat in my face. Like, I want to prosecute. So they sign, I will prosecute. And then sometimes you're right. If it's like a simple battery, there's basically like different levels of battery in the state of Florida. Battery is actually like physical touching or hitting or whatever. If it's simple battery, which is a touch or a strike that doesn't result in injury, then oftentimes if the prosecution gets dropped for that, then the case is going to be dropped. But if it's like aggravated battery, where there's actually like, physical harm, grievous physical harm and all that kind of stuff, that's actually the case that I'm looking at specifically, where the state took it upon themselves to be like, hey, we know you don't want to testify and we know that you don't want to go proceed with the case, but we're going to go ahead to anyways, just because this motherfucker has, excuse my French, but this motherfucker has like a long ass rap sheet. And on top of that, this isn't the first time. And on top of that, you've been intimidated out of, court proceedings in the past. So we're going to go ahead and proceed.
Sure, I can understand. All right. Yeah, I'm probably sympathetic to that. Sure.
Okay. All right. So what I was really trying to punch at there, which I don't mind any tangents or asides, especially if we're being descriptive or if we find contention.
Sure.
So I think that I want to circle back to my question because it's a hypothetical that I've been playing with.
Yeah.
The hypothetical that I've been playing with is there such a way in which the prosecution could still do its job, but then the defense attorneys, as we've previously mentioned, their job is kind of to present alternatives and hypotheticals and all that kind of stuff. Would there be such a way in which maybe they wouldn't be so aggressive? So for instance, just as an example, I'll try to be brief, but a murder case that I saw in my jurisdiction, they hired like a awesome defense team with like 5 different lawyers, and they were basically doing something what's called addressing the CSI effect, where they're saying like, oh, there's not gunshot residue here, and the cops didn't take the dimensions, and they didn't do this, and they didn't do that. And they basically talked about a whole bunch of like investigative material and investigative evidence that really has nothing to do with the homicide. But what they did is they kind of threw everything they could at the wall to kind of say that like police incompetence may have created like alternative scenarios other than what the prosecution is proposing. And to me, that just sounds like a bunch of bullshit.
Well, if it's a bunch of bullshit, then you should be able to prove it in front of a jury that it is, right? That these investigative tools weren't relevant or not necessary or...
Yeah, and like I would actually be curious about Pisco, because I was wondering like what I was actually thinking about that when I was sitting in the I don't know, like the bystander box, whatever the fuck they call that. And I was just thinking to myself, it's like, if I was the prosecution, as soon as this person, and they didn't do this, as soon as I was done, I would be like, this is literally the CSI effect. This is literally people bringing in forensic analysis in order to confuse juries. And this is actually like a well-known phenomena within the past like decade and a half, since CSI and all of the offshoots were so incredibly popular on television, defense attorneys would basically bring up all of these like data points that had nothing to do with investigations in order to confuse the jury. And I don't have respect for the average intellect of the average person.
I mean, but that's kind of how our judicial system works, right? It's all based on the average person, literally.
But are we being? But that's kind of what I'm poking at here is like, are we being descriptive, or are we like pushing for like the ideal of what could be, I guess, or the best thing? And that's what I keep asking is like, if defense attorneys became less combative in their representation of their defendants, and all they were there to do was basically to make sure that the rights of their defendants weren't violated. I don't know.
Well, I don't think that's not their only job, is to make sure people's rights weren't violated, right? Like their job is to make it so that the state has to present a case beyond a reasonable doubt that a crime was committed, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I just have to toy it more in my mind because, like, I want to figure out a way. Like, I'm not saying that this is ever going to be possible, but for me, just on the law enforcement side, it just felt like a lot of bullshit.
I understand that, and you're on the law enforcement side, so it should feel like a lot of bullshit because the defense is literally there to make your job as hard as possible and to fuck you up as much as possible and to poison as much of your shit as possible. And I think it's easy to see. Especially when we're watching movies and shit, right? Like how fucked that can be, right? Because like, oh my God, like we know this guy's guilty, obviously, right? But the problem is that if we start laxing those standards, then you run into other very weird shit. So like, here's like a problem, and people rarely consider the other sides of things. Let's say that we pull somebody over, okay? And you looking at this kid and it's like, this motherfucker's got, I know a crackhead when I see one. He's got crack in his car. I know it. So you make up some bullshit. It's like, okay, fuck you. I smell weed. Get out of the car. I'm going to search your shit. You dig through the back. You find a pipe. You find a stash. You take him down to the station. Fuck this guy. We got him. The problem is that, so now when you go to court, my understanding is that if you didn't have a good reason to pull him over and search his car, all of that evidence is going to be tossed. Even though it's illegal. He's in the possession of drugs, maybe even like a huge amount. It's like, it's bullshit. Why does that get thrown out? Like you saw him, you caught him committing a crime. The problem is that if we allow that evidence to stand, there's a legal descriptor for this. I don't remember if it's like fruit of a poison tree or something, but if we allow that type of evidence to stand, then what happens is you start to create really bad incentives on the law enforcement side to just don't play by the rules, bend the rules, break the rules, because as long as you can find something, the shit'll stick and fuck them. So like maybe, maybe you no-knock some dude's door, you don't have a warrant, fuck it, but you know they got drugs in there, you go in, right? Maybe it gets to the point where police get to take more and more increasingly aggressive actions. They're starting to terrorize citizens. We have an amendment that protects us from unwarranted search and seizure. And basically cops are just like, running amok, and they know that as long as they do find some shit, like it'll stick, and who cares otherwise? That's the reason why we have such stringent protections on the defense side, is to prevent creating those malincentives for cops to act in ways that we would consider like counterintuitive or to like citizens' rights, I guess.
Yeah, and this is where the defunding conversation gets like a little bit frustrating for me individually, because basically with everything that you just said, like I don't think I have any contention. But then law enforcement has to be enabled in order to do a good job. Sure. And what I mean by this is like basically like, oh man, my starting salary was like 43. With overtime, I was making 55, and I was like, "Oh shit, I'm fucking banking." That was like the first time that I'd ever made a living wage in my entire life. And like a decent chunk of the time, I would say 90% of the time, I felt like I was overpaid because I'm like, "Oh, I'm driving around, I'm chilling, I'm doing like what amounts to book reports on interesting things in my city. This is a sweet fucking job. I fucking love this." And then I got into some intense shit, like some serious fights, people getting killed, all that kind of stuff. And I was like, oh my God, you would have to pay me like $150K for this to be worth it, basically. Sure. And it's not that I didn't love it, but basically that's one of my frustrations with the defund the police thing, is because like, if you want to talk about like increasing, I don't know, the fucking material conditions or, like creating better societies so police officers have less to do, I am right there with you. But what I have a problem with is this demand that law enforcement officers kind of be like emotionless robots who know how to perfectly, prosecute crimes and know how to gather good evidence, and they know how to deal with state attorneys and all that kind of shit. Mm-hmm. And then you're like, oh, how much are you going to pay them? And you're like, oh, starting is $39,500.
Yeah, people will say like, yeah, we want to defund the police, but we also want to increase the training, give them 50 more responsibilities, have them wear body cam. Right? It's like, okay, well, we're going to need way more money for all of this. For sure, I agree with that. Yeah.
Well, and then I just wanted to kind of tell everybody too, a lot of the shit that you mentioned is real. So for instance, there's something called exigent circumstances. It's where, and this was literally joked about while I was going through the academy because there was like old timers around. Mm-hmm. You could not get away with this shit nowadays. But apparently like narco cops in like the 90s, they would literally like go to houses and do what's called like knock and talks, where somebody knocks on the front door in order to like talk to somebody in a suspected drug house.
Yeah.
And then another cop would go to the back of the house and they'd be like, help me. And they would like scream that shit in the background. And one of the exigent circumstances is like immediate threat of like death or great bodily harm. Mm-hmm. So they use the narco cop who was knowingly yelling in the back of the property as if they were in danger as an excuse to burst into the house.
And similar so today, people complain about police dogs doing this, basically, is that you get the dog to bark, and then that's like your ability to go into a car and you say, fuck it, even though it's all, people will say like some of this is set up from the start. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to show my hippie or centrist credentials, I think like I'm not for, maybe I'm for like decrim of like cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin and all that harder shit, but I am not for legalization. And then for marijuana, I'm for pretty much recreational or medicinal, as long as it's like regulated. So, and also like another shout out to the audience or whatever. If you smoke pot in your car and you're in a state in which that's not legal, that is the easiest way for a law enforcement officer to get into your car. Just absolutely fucking easiest way, because that stink stays, and that's enough for them to get into the fucking car. So basically just smoke at home. That's what I'm saying.
Sure.
All right, so I think we did that. And then this is like a descriptor. Maybe, I don't know if you'll be able to find contention or not. But basically I was saying like the way the system should operate and the way people feel are two different things. That I don't think that should be like a major contention.
Okay, what do you mean by that? Go ahead.
Me being booty hurt about like defense attorneys giving their clients an aggressive defense, regardless of my feelings of that, just because I feel that way and I wish like more aggressively guilty people were ending up in prison, doesn't mean that just because I'm articulating that emotion means that I think the system should change from the utilitarian standpoint.
Yeah, a lot of people have trouble understanding that. Yeah, like I think that this is something I wish people would understand more. I think that a lot of things in society should emerge fundamentally from negotiations, from two positions with contrary interests. But people seem to think that no one in society should have a contrary interest. People instead should advocate for what's best for everybody. But that's just not how that works. So like something that I'll bring this up for a lot is like unions. People seem to think that unions like want to make society a better place and blah, blah, blah. They don't. They just want to like advocate for their workers. And they should. That's all they should care about. Like corporations should try to fuck over labor as hard as possible, whatever the government won't allow, whatever the government allows them to do, because the goal of a corporation is to make as much money as possible. That's what they should do. And unions should try to fuck over the corporation as much as possible and fuck over the employees, because that's what they should try to do. They should advocate their workers. And then hopefully, ideally, we meet somewhere in the middle where you've got two sides that are advocating really hard for their positions, and then we negotiate something where everybody feels a little fucked and everybody feels a little good. And that's like ideally where we wind up at.
See, okay, so this is my contention is like I think it's okay that that's the way the world is, that we set up the world with like knowing contention, because like, so for instance, like I think that people are fundamentally self-interested and kind of bad. And so like we should create systems based off of people being self-interested and kind of shitty.
Sure.
But individually we should strive to like value more than that.
Nah,
so for instance, like,
but go ahead. The reason why I say fuck that is because as soon as you start thinking that way, you're going to get fucked. If you go to your job and you try to like say like, oh, okay, I can help you guys out, that company doesn't give a fuck about you, and they will fuck you as soon as it's convenient for them to do so. So you should advocate for yourself as strong as you can, and let the company advocate for itself, or let the other party advocate for themselves. If they want to give ground or whatever, I mean, if this is like a relationship, it's different. But generally in life, I think you should advocate for your position as fiercely and as hardly as possible, because the other person is going to be doing the same for themselves. Fuck any come to Jesus bullshit in the middle. No, you advocate for yourself.
All right, so
that's how I feel about God.
Okay, no. I am sympathetic on like a real descriptive, but this actually, I don't know if you remember me talking to you about Bartolome de las Casas.
Not much, but go for it.
No. It was just like it was this whole conversation about like I don't know, like individuals versus collectives and people like advocating for stuff. And I was basically saying that like the only time that real positive change has come in this world is people who were willing to break that, I think, predictable expectation. I think you're right that like most people are self-interested and fucky and kind of assholes and like all that kind of shit. But some of the greatest shit that we've had in life, some of the greatest like moral and historical victories have often come from people who were being irrational. So whether or not you were talking about like the abolition of slavery or like fighting, I think slavery is a good example. But fighting against slavery or fascism or something like that, oftentimes it took people who were not. They were appealing to ideals that were beyond self-interest in order to abolish these like moral wrongs. So I don't have as aggressive as like a moral nihilist position as you do at all. So,
Okay.
yeah. So we don't have to agree. All right. So I think that's fairly settled, and I'm gonna put part of my motivation down here. So your editor kind of like. I don't think he left in. No, it's okay. It's all right. The game is the game. Okay. I don't have any shade. But the basically the edit of that video, it just looked like I was advocating for goon squads and for like arbitrary extrajudicial prosecution of citizens. And that was kind of like antithetical to my point. I was actually talking about like police brutality specifically and how it existed. I was telling that to Dooby, who's kind of an authoritarian. And then also I was just using examples to be descriptive, not prescriptive. So some DGGers took issue and they thought that I was being prescriptive when I was being descriptive. But
Gotcha. Okay.
let's move into the next part. So goon squads. Okay. So this was a concept. I understand people didn't like the rhetoric or the concept or the words. But goon squad is basically a description of corrections officers when there's somebody who's being combative. 5 or 6 very large corrections officers will basically go in a group and they will deal with a combative person. So oftentimes this would be my
I need you to set the stage for this. Are you talking about somebody that's like actively resisting arrest or just somebody at their house, or what do you mean?
Yeah. So, this is corrections officers. So this is already in the jail. Somebody has been arrested. Okay. They've been put in handcuffs. They're on their way to jail. They're kicking out the window. They're kicking the grill in the back of the police car. They're spitting. They're cussing. They're talking about killing people, this, that, the other. And then basically they're not in control. So what law enforcement officers will do is they will call, what's, I guess, layman's term, a goon squad, which is basically the 5 burliest corrections officers on duty to help remove the person from the vehicle in as safe a manner as possible, while also being very incredibly aggressive. Okay. Do we have anything there so far?
When you say from the vehicle, what do you mean by that?
People are being transported into jail from law enforcement vehicles.
I understand what you're saying. Okay, go for it.
Yeah, so goon squads are not cops. They are cops in a way. They're oftentimes like undersheriffs or deputies, but they are jail personnel. They're not law enforcement officers. Okay. All right, cool. So basically my contention here, I never heard you say anything to the contrary, but I just wanted to elucidate and see if there's any contention. What I would say is that oftentimes having 5 people who are stronger than the person that's there is oftentimes the safest way to remove somebody from that environment. And my citations would be pepper spray, in my experience, oftentimes makes things worse. It makes people panic. It makes them uncomfortable. It makes them angry. It can make them at a disadvantage in a fight, but pepper spraying somebody in handcuffs is kind of fucked up. And then I would also say that with tasers, tasers are not known to be hyper reliable, and also in the past, it's rare, but it's real. They can cause cardiac issues. Okay. So that would be my contention that the
we're on this we're probably not going to find much disagreement. The way that I usually phrase this to people, and this is just an unfortunate reality that nobody will ever be okay with. Non-compliance is always going to be rough. There's just no easy way about it. There is no secret jujitsu technique. There is no secret pressure point. If you've got a fully adult male that doesn't want to comply, it's going to be a violent process to bring that person under compliance, and there's just no way around that. And a lot of people just will never accept that. So.
Okay,
yeah.
then that's cool. So all I've done is like de-nuked, or hopefully if this gets posted, then hopefully my reputation in DGG improves somewhat, since it seems like we largely agree. All right, so then the only other thing that I wanted to bring up, because we actually blazed through those pretty quickly, was I just tuned into the AMA a little bit, just for shits and gigs, because hey, fuck it, you're entertaining when you're fucking answering questions. Aggressively. So I just kind of want to talk about like the social meme of religion. I think that I am probably pretty politically, religiously aligned with like the Jordan Peterson thing, like mode of thought, where it's not so much the literal religious truth that is important. It's more like the moral, metaphorical, mythological, Jungian interpretation that kind of gives people stories in order to root their lives and in order to make moral decisions. Okay. And then that was kind of my thing, was that you mentioned the part that you're like, hey, I'm cool with religion and spirituality as long, like for the communitarian aspect and for like the, visiting people once a week and all of that kind of stuff. But one of the things I wanted to say is that like, that's part of it. But one of the things that I think is most important is like the contemplation of the philosophical, or the contemplation of the moral, or the contemplation of the mortal, like just being a mortal creature on the planet. And that's kind of like the value that I find in religion. So I didn't know if you had anything there.
Yeah, I mean, you're allowed to find value in it in however you want. I mean, my argument as an atheist, of course, is I'm going to say that like religion is an unfortunate shortcut to a lot of that thought, and actually is counterintuitive to a lot of that thought, because instead of encouraging you to actually consider it, you kind of get a cheat sheet book that gives you all the answers without requiring any actual contemplation. Although you could still in that and say, well, even if you are religious, obviously there's still a great deal of contemplation. So for instance, you might believe there's a God, but contemplating the question of why is there evil in the world, rather than just saying, well, there's evil in the world because there is no God, or because there is no God and I'm atheist. There theoretically could be theological interpretations that are somewhat profound if you think about that. So for instance, like the favorite answer is like, oh, well, evil is actually a lack of God, like darkness is a lack of light, which might lead you to think that like, okay, well, a lot of negative things on earth are caused by people and we can change it, et cetera, right? Sure. So yeah, I mean, like, yeah. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Well, and then so basically my follow-up contention with that is basically like, do you think that most people have the time or ability to consider moral, philosophical, and religious questions to the depth that you just highlighted? So I know you're saying that like religion kind of robs us of the ability to pursue that, but what I would say is that oftentimes people aren't interested. These questions are terrifying. A lot of them are incredibly deep and weird and anxiety-inducing. So a lot of people just don't want to consider them at all. So it's actually easier to give them a cheat sheet where you're like, hey, God's real. He sent his son. Here's like 10 basic rules for following it. Here's another like 20 stories about how to be a good person. Don't be a fucking asshole. Come to church on Sundays. Don't eat shellfish if you're allergic.
That could entirely be the case. Yeah, it's kind of like how it's actually similar to my stance on gender abolition. I think it'd be really interesting to see like a genderless society. I think there could be like cool things that could happen as a result of that. However, it might be the case that like gender and the story of gender is just something that's so important to humans. That's like a fundamental part of the human experience. You can't actually divorce that from most people's lives. That might be the case. I don't actually know. Yeah, so I just kind of like push for what I think is nice, and then I would recognize, if I'm being honest, like, yeah, maybe these easy moral stories are important for us because not everybody can sit down and read 50 different Wikipedia articles on what their favorite normative ethics position is or something. Sure.
Well, and then so this would be like kind of like I don't want to say a bone to pick, but one of the things that I get scared of when 10 head fucking galaxy brains, YouTubers and Twitchers such as yourself are very popular with the young people. What I worry about is it seems like you're at peace with your analysis of the world, just you know your moral foundations, how you spend your time, how you spend your life, and all that kind of stuff. And I just think that you're like a pretty unique person. So I think like a lot of young people might be like, damn, Destiny's cool as fuck. He fucking, you know, his girlfriend's hot, and you know he fucks. And he, you know, I don't know if you drink or smoke, but he plays video games all day and he talks about like smart shit all day. This is fucking badass. So I want to be an atheist and I want to be a gamer, bro. And I want to be a philosopher, bro. And they just don't have like the tools to really follow you down that path and be philosophically or morally or religiously or spiritually comfortable. And oftentimes when I talk to people who are not atheistic, but anti-theistic, oftentimes almost as a part of that conversation, I hear stuff about like anxiety, depression.
Yeah, 100%. Like an even better example of this is like I'm pretty sure I have a lot of friends that are fucking like into open relationships and shit now because I have an open relationship, even though most of these people probably can't handle it and are going to be fucking miserable inside of it, and it's a bad idea for them to even try to go down that road. Yeah, I'm sure this happens, of course. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, and then that was just going to be my thing. Like I'm not trying to hold your feet to the fire or anything like that, but that's what I'm saying. Like,
yeah, this is I can actually like I actually went through so much of this personally. I'm 32 now. It used to be the case that like if I go back 6 or 7 years ago, I would give a lot of prescriptive advice based on things that have worked for me, and it took like a good level of maturation for me to realize that like, okay, actually, hold on, not everybody's like me. Maybe I need to like be a little bit more generalized with my advice. And I can think of a million examples. So one example is like, I'm not like huge on like family attachment. I just don't care much. So, you know, I'll read Reddit threads about like, oh, my mom or my dad is a huge piece of shit, blah, blah. What do I do? Like, and my response would just be like, dude, if you've got a toxic family, cut them out of your life. That's the easiest decision in the fucking world. Don't talk to your mom or dad ever again. Fuck them. Easy. Boom. Done. And I would give that advice unironically, you know, 9, 7, 6, maybe even 5 years ago. I would just say like, yeah, fuck them. Cut them out of your life. Who cares, right? But now like I'm a little bit older and it's like, okay, well, hold on. You know, there are people who obviously don't live their lives that way. They don't see the world that way. It's probably not fair for me to give that type of advice to somebody because not everybody is as okay as I am with like making those types of cuts in their life. So I agree with you. Yeah. Like you have to be careful when you're like, as an influencer, right? When we tell people to do certain things, they might not necessarily have like all the underlying pieces in place to execute those things in the same way that you do, which makes it a little bit dangerous to give that advice to people.
Yeah, and so just to expand on that point, so I identify as like centrist or center right, and the reason why I do is because I think there are conservative memes that are necessary. So like I'm not like religious and I'm not like a religious literalist, but I do think in like the Jungian or like Petersonian perspective that like these myths and these stories are trying to tell you something, and if you can extract that value from it and then implement it into your own life, you'll probably be a better person than if you had never considered it at all. And then also, I think that certain things, like kind of like you said, I think some people can be in open relationships and be healthy. I think some people can be promiscuous and maybe be more emotionally and mentally healthier than other people when they're being promiscuous. But I am more concerned with like what works for most people and like enforcing that culturally, not from like a legalistic standpoint. I think that's a step too far. But putting like a cultural pressure on people where it's like, hey, if you're one of these individuals who can function differently than everybody else, awesome, and you do you. But if you're looking for like a story or a narrative or a moral ethic that seemed to work for most people in the past, here's this moral ethic that you can turn to in order to function like a fucking normie, basically.
Yeah, you can make a lot of similar comparisons to like certain like kind of like feminist schools of thought, right? Where it's like, you know, if you want to be a stay-at-home mom and do that and pump out babies and everything, that's fine, go for it, knock yourself out, that's okay. Like not everybody has to be like a computer engineer or like the first female in their rocket science program. Like not everybody has to do that. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, and trying to say that like if you don't do that, you're a failure, you fucked up, is probably more negative than it needs to be. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the cultural recalibration that I'm trying to do in the right, because I think the right, correctly or incorrectly, feels like they're culturally on the back foot. I think they feel like they've lost a lot of ground, whether that's in like mainstream media, alternative media within the past 3 to 5 years. So they feel like they have to very aggressively defend conservative lifestyle, Christianity in general, the Second Amendment, like all that kind of stuff. And basically, I'm trying to recalibrate the balance where the left isn't sprinting down a leftward trajectory and the right is sprinting down a rightward trajectory, both of them trying to, live their most like stereotypically factional life, and instead say like, hey, there's some good components of both of these. You should incorporate what works with you into your life. And I know that's very liberal of me, but that's what I'm trying to do with some level of common sense. So that's kind of what I'm doing.
Yeah, I agree. I think that
sorry,
all of these things, and I say this, and I wish that people this is what I advocate for. When I talk about like analyzing like categories or philosophy or any of that shit, the goal should never be to like change the way you live your life. The goal should just be to give you some tools to look at your life a little bit differently. And if through the utilization of those tools, you decide to make a different choice, well, that's awesome, because now you've been given a tool that's let you make a different decision than maybe you otherwise would have made, right? It might be the case that like you've been in 6 relationships in a row and you cheat on every single person you're with and it just doesn't work for you. And then somebody's like, hey, here's a different type of relationship. And you look at it and you're like, this actually works for me so well. And now your life is like better because somebody's like provided you with an alternative. You're like, oh, cool, this works. I like this. This is better. Or it might be the case that you're in a relationship and you're, whatever, and somebody introduces the idea of open relationships to you and you're like, you know what, this isn't for me, but it's an interesting way of looking at things. And you know what? Looking at how people in open relationships get sex from different people or whatever, that concept, I wonder if that would work better applied to my own relationship, but maybe not for sex, but maybe for other things. Like maybe my wife or husband doesn't need to be my best friend in every single fucking thing I do. Maybe we can get different things from different people. Like I've got friends that I talked about TV shows. I don't have to do everything with my significant other, right? But like all I'm saying is that the reason why I like personally to be exposed to lots of different information and lifestyles and whatever isn't so that I can live my most libcuck life in the most extreme out there way possible. It's more just like when I see how other people do things and I see what works for other people and I get information about other things, sometimes it lets me make positive changes in my own life. And I'm like, oh, cool, I didn't even consider that before. So like, yeah, I'll make that change or whatever. That's why I like, introducing people to new ideas and new things. Not to tell them they have to do it, but just like, hey, here's an idea, absorb what you can from it, and maybe you can make changes in your own life based on it, or maybe not, or maybe it'll just help you understand something better. Yeah.
I'm gonna cite you my previous religious argument. So I think that a lot of people, I do think that there's like a decent chunk of the population that has time, energy, and a moral consideration in order to like explore all these different things. And again, like if it works for you, it fucking works for you, right? But there's a whole bunch of fucking normies who might fall into the trap of being like, oh, that cool guy is in an open relationship, I'm gonna try. And then as a result, like, I'm too jealous for that shit. I already know I'm too jealous for that shit. I'm never gonna fucking try it because like I just know I have a big like Kronk caveman brain.
Sure.
And I'm pretty sure my wife has said the same thing. I'm pretty sure she said she's not interested in in sharing, basically. And that might be like a really caveman mindset, very unevolved of us.
Or I mean, like a lot of, to borrow from Jungian, baby, right? A lot of people seem to feel that way. So that probably maps on to some true part of the human experience, which is fine. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, no. And that's what I was going to say is like, so for most people, monogamy or serial monogamy, where maybe they're not with one person for their entire life, but when they're in a committed relationship, they try to stay as committed as possible. Yeah. I'm not saying that's going to work for everybody, but I'm just saying for most people, it even if it doesn't work, it uncomplicates a lot of variables. Yeah. And that's what I wanted people to consider is just how fucking complex. Like, if one relationship is complex, just imagine maintaining 5. Like, holy shit.
I think one thing that people are really, really afraid of, and I'll use this word as much as I can, people are really afraid of the concept of normal. And I think that's damaging sometimes. Like, it is perfectly okay, and I try to do this again, it's perfectly okay to suggest something like, this is not normal, just so you know, right? Like, and I'll do that when I talk about certain things. Like, there are things that I do, this is pretty outside the norm. I wouldn't expect everybody to be able to do this or to enjoy doing this, and it's okay to acknowledge that and recognize that. And then, like, you can give advice or talk to people from there. But you don't have to pretend that every single person ought to be able to handle or do a particular thing. Otherwise, there's something wrong with them.
Yeah, and normal is such a weird fucking word, right?
Yeah, the reason why people don't like normal is because it carries with it this underlying condemnation or approval. When people hear normal, what they think of is whatever you're saying is good and whatever's outside of that is bad. That's why people don't like it when you say like being straight is normal, because usually when people say that, the underlying connotation is normal is good, being straight is good, and abnormal or not normal is bad. Especially because we think of normal in terms of like medical or stuff like that. That's abnormal. That's not normal. Yeah.
I wish we could remove that stigma because so for instance, like I like, even if I was to talk about like normal as a concept and I was going to say like serial monogamy was normal or whatever, what I'm trying to say with that is not like a moral objection to people who consider like, you know, polyamorous relationships or whatever, if they can figure it out. But basically a statement that a statistical majority of the population are going to find serial monogamous relationships less complicated and easier to navigate. And especially when it comes to raising children, if you think that's an important part of the human experience, that's going to uncomplicate a lot of the things that are really fucking complicated about raising kids.
Sure.
And it's not that raising kids is already hard enough. Worrying about a interesting relational dynamic or sex life on top of that, it's like, holy shit, like my kid's already like the center of all my attention and energy. Adding in these other factors seems really difficult.
For sure. Which is fair.
Yeah. So you kind of brought something up, and I kind of wanted to hit it real quick. I'm not looking for contention. If you got something to do, I'm not going to mind. I'm happy that we blaze through the memes. Good. But yeah, so basically, like, I think we brought this up before, and I didn't understand your point, and now I do. But I just kind of wanted to bring it up again. So I know that you're a determinist, and this is not a moral prescription on like human choice or something like that. This is more just like a description of reality based off of all the variables that you observe in reality, how people interact with the world and all that kind of stuff. Even if they're making choices, those choices are rooted in everything that came before, right?
Yeah, causality thing, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess my contention with that, and it's not really like a contention about whether or not determinism is like factually true in like the chain of being. My contention is that the conception of free will or the conception of choice might change the way that you make choices. So it would just be another variable in the chain of causality, but as a variable in the chain of causality, if you're like, I'm a hardline determinist, everything fucking happens happens in a chain that I can't control, this, that, the other. Therefore, I'm going to make the choices that I'm going to make, but like, I'm not going to put a whole bunch of like weight into the choices because I know ultimately what's going to happen is going to happen, versus somebody who believes in free will, or at least believes in choice. They might weigh their options more aggressively just because they think that they have a choice.
So I think generally, humans with more information, except for in the realm of drugs, I think humans with more information generally make better choices. So what I would argue is there are bad ways to read into determinism that might make you make bad choices, but that generally having a better view of it will let you make bigger choices. And actually, I'm gonna borrow from this so much. I'm gonna harp on this Jungian stuff, the story stuff. Do you know who Dr. K is on Twitch?
I do. I watched your and Melina's, and I want to say like 2 or 3 other creators interviews with them, and they were absolutely fucking fascinating. I think he's great.
So a younger me would have said that like, I don't want all this mystical bullshit. I don't need the fucking whatever weird Indian or Buddhist or whatever shit you're telling me. I don't need it. I don't know what the point of that is.
Talk about D-Dog.
Yeah. It might be the case, though. It might be the case that having those stories, they are just stories, but they might map onto real things that can give us more power in terms of understanding the underlying concepts. So I'm going to say one thing. So I'm a determinist, okay? That means that I think all of our choices are causally influenced, et cetera, et cetera. That's a very cold way of viewing the world. I think I can view it that way and take a good reading from it. However, I think that a lot of parents raising their kids say very deterministic things as well, but they don't package it that way. So here's 2 pieces of advice that I heard from my mom all throughout my life that I think are really good pieces of advice that are highly determinist. So one, my mom would always say when we were consuming bad media, she would say, garbage in, garbage out. Garbage in, garbage out. If you watch a bunch of trash media, if you watch a bunch of porn and whatever, you're going to be a bad person. She'd say that, and then she'd use another phrase around me a lot. She'd say, you are who you hang around, or you are who your friends are, right? So both of these are like, I think, pretty common sense, decent advice for kids. If you consume a lot of garbage, you're going to spew a lot of garbage, and if you've got a bunch of bad friends, you probably know this if you were law enforcement, right? People that hang around bad people or they get out of jail and go back to hang around bad people will always do bad things again. You're fucked. Or people trying to break addictions, right? So like, I think that's an example of like, these are both pieces of advice that are actually super deterministic. These are hardline deterministic things, but they're not packaged that way, right? And as long as you're thinking of the world that way, so rather than thinking like, well, I'm not gonna make any good choices because fuck it, I'm determined I'll make whatever choice anyway. Instead, what you might say is like, you know what? Everything is determined. I'm going to be really careful about what kind of environment I'm in or what I surround myself with, because I know that's going to heavily influence the choices I make in the future.
Yeah, fuck yeah. Like everything you said, like if I, unfortunately, I think I've created and bumped into negative determinists. People who said like, oh, I can't control the world, therefore what fucking difference does it make? Oftentimes this atheism is tied with like a cosmic nihilism or nihilism in general. So there's no meaning, there's no point. I shouldn't fucking, I should just like, and I understand like this can lead to hedonism. Unfortunately, hedonism doesn't work for me individually. I am a normal person who tried to do hedonism for a while. It didn't work. And basically, like, unfortunately, I think I've bumped into or imagined your negative example more than your positive example. But if somebody said the phrase, I am a determinist, therefore I'm going to like cultivate the variables that I can control within my limited sphere of influence. That way I turn out to be the coolest, most badass, most positive, most gung-ho motherfucker around. That I would have absolutely no problem. And like whatever my fucking little philosophical quibbles about like free will versus determinism would ultimately be like something to smoke a joint about and like argue until 2 a.m.
Sure.
Not a like moral indictment of the other person.
Yeah, and I would 100% agree with you. There's a lot of like quote unquote philosophy or whatever, or stuff that's taken that people just kind of use as a cheap excuse not to do anything. And people could do that with atheism or determinism. Yeah, I'll give you another one, and I don't know, you might have even said this. I have said this in the past. A lot of people will say things like here's a common question that I hear a lot. And this is going to sound really mean to a lot of people. I'm sorry, but it's the truth. A lot of people will say like, I don't know how to find reliable media sources. I don't know what reliable media is. It's really hard to find a good source. That's not true. The reality is that you just don't want to read any articles. Because if you did read any articles and you did have any media literacy, you'd know that like, if you read through like most mainstream articles, you're going to get a general realistic accounting of the facts that might have like a slight bias, but there's not going to be like crazy different like stories between like one publication and another. That's just not the case. The only people that say that are usually people that don't actually want to do the reading, and then they just use that as an excuse. That is the reality of things. And it sounds mean to say that, but like it is absolutely the case. And people do the same thing with nihilism or atheism or whatever, like, oh, who cares? None of it matters anyway. And it's like, well, you're not really taking this and using this concept to empower yourself. You're just using it as an excuse to justify your apathy or your laziness, for sure.
Oh, dude, holy fuck. Like, while I'm on your fucking platform, can I just call out the fucking Twitter dumb fucks who like don't read their own goddamn articles? So they're literally like they're like sharing shit and pretending that it's a fucking point, but then you click on the fucking article, you get halfway down it, and you're like, this isn't even the fucking point that you're making with your goddamn quote tweet.
Oh yeah.
And oh my fucking god. All right, anyway, sorry. It was my mistake for creating a Twitter profile, but still. Before we lose the point, I wanted to bring this up because I think it's incredibly interesting. You were talking about like religious memes that might give people knowledge and therefore power to live their lives differently. And the Bhagavad Gita, I heard this, so I didn't read it because I'm an asshole. But basically, like, the opening story is like a prince who's trying to decide. This is, again, just like bad repetition. But it's a prince who is basically saying that like the world is constantly destroying itself and the world is constantly in flux and conflict. And I do not want to be part of the flux and conflict of this world. I do not want to create any more suffering. And basically, I forget who it is, but one of the gods or goddesses walks down and they're like, hey, whether you like it or not, you're a part of the system, and to imagine yourself outside of it is a fucking illusion. So even if you were to like run into the forest and run into the trees and not participate in the world and not affect anything, you would still be a part of the system, and your lack of presence and your lack of influence would in and of itself be a action upon the world. And so I forget how the story goes, but basically that's kind of like a call to action where he's like, well, fuck, if I'm a part of the system, I'm a part of the system. I have to do what I can anyways. And so I think that's really powerful, especially as somebody who overthinks. Oftentimes, I don't know about you, but I've tried to think past my mortality. I've tried to be a wallflower and basically not get like consumed by the fights of the day by thinking through them. And I have found that I am woefully ill-equipped to stay above the fray of the world. So like, it is, yeah, I just wanted to share that, I guess.
Sure. Yeah, I don't disagree. It's there's also like to kind of go along with that, like a lot of people aren't comfortable with this, but indecision is a decision. Time is always moving forward, and oftentimes you're forced. Yeah, and oftentimes making no decision is like the worst.
Yeah. An imperfect plan today, or like an imperfect plan executed today is worth a perfect plan that's never executed.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
100%. Well, dude, this was I'm out of memes, but I fucking love this, and I want to keep it nice and clean and tight for your dickhole of an editor who made me look like an asshole on your platform. Okay. But I want to show him the respect that he didn't show me. So unless there's any memes or any contentions or philosophical things, I really don't have much else. So
no, I think that's basically it. Yeah, I can't think of anything, but yeah, I appreciate the conversation. It's been fun.
Yeah, no, sincerely appreciated. I am going to shut myself out if that's acceptable.
Yeah, go for it.
All right, cool. My name is Connor. I run a YouTube channel named Counterpoints. I do rants into the void about like religion, politics, and philosophy some of the time. I identify as centrist or center right. I am also a Marine veteran and a law enforcement veteran, so I like to talk about violent media. I am currently breaking down Full Metal Jacket, which is one of the best war movies ever made. I'm breaking down End of Watch, which is one of the best law enforcement movies ever made. And I also am a massive science fiction nerd. If you ever see me on panel shows and I'm painting something, I'm painting Warhammer miniatures, which is one of the best science fiction universes ever made. So I very much appreciate you giving me an opportunity to come onto your platform and talk about a bunch of really cool shit with you. I wish you well, and I hope you have an excellent night. And DGG, you're a bunch of fucking assholes, but I hope you have an excellent night as well.
All right, cool. Thanks a lot. I appreciate the talk, my dude.
Remember to hit that like and subscribe, and don't forget the notification bell so that my videos show up right in your feed.
For your dickhole of an editor